There are other things that we could be using. You know, the media generally, and I say this as a reformed journalist, the media gives us a very toxic view of the world. Most of the news we get is about disaster, threats, horrible things happening to people. It's news for the amygdala. The amygdala is a very primitive part of the brain that wants to know what are the dangers. However, if we were to take, on any given day, all of the acts of kindness performed around the globe, you know, a mom feeding her kid is an act of kindness. And we were to put it on one scale, and then we're to take all the atrocious acts and put them on another scale, the acts of kindness would far outweigh those of meanness. But we don't get that sense of the world looking through a media lens. But we can use the media better. One example I like is Sesame Street. If you have a toddler, have had a toddler, you may have watched Sesame Street. Sesame Street, I found when I visited Sesame Workshop, is actually a very sophisticated operation. The day I went there, the script writers were meeting with two cognitive scientists. They're actually meeting about cognitive control, because Sesame Street segments turn out to be lessons based in science, wrapped in entertainment. One of the things that segments that aired this season is the Cookie Connoisseur Club. I don't know if you're familiar with Cookie Monster. Cookie Monster is one of the stars of Sesame Street, and he loves to gobble cookies. But Alan, who runs a store on Sesame Street, decided to start a Cookie Connoisseur Club, very much like a wine connoisseur club. In the Cookie Connoisseur Club, you take a cookie and you study it to see if there are imperfections. Then you sniff it for aroma, and then you take a nibble to taste it. Cookie Monster, of course, was dying to get into the club. So Alan gives him a cookie, and he instantly gobbles it down. He can't restrain himself. So Alan tells him, you know, in this club, we're going to try all kinds of cookies. So if you don't gobble it down, I can let you into the club, and you're going to be able to eat many, many different kinds of cookies. That does it for Cookie. So that's a lesson. This is a show that is loved by 2 to 4-year-olds. And 2 to 4-year-olds learn largely by modeling. So what's happening with Cookie is that the kids are learning a lesson in cognitive control. And I think the more of that, the better. So let me finish with by telling you about a smart use of positive emotion, of being able to manage our own internal world, of that inner focus. There is a remarkable man named Matthew Ricard. He's written some books on happiness. He's French. He has a doctorate in cell biology from Pasteur Institute. His mentor there actually won a Nobel Prize for the research they're doing. But after graduate school, he made a startling decision. He decided he'd give up science and go to the Himalayas, become a monk, and meditate for the rest of his life. He's been called, I think by his publisher's publicist, the happiest man in the world, because he's been studied by scientists, and on this right to left ratio, he's very far to the left. There's a scientist named Paul Ekman, who's the world's expert on the facial expression of emotion. Paul is the keenest observer of the face as a revealer of what you're feeling. He's a very dangerous man. I once was walking down the street with Paul on the way to a meeting that I was conducting, and Paul was telling me about a system for training people to get good at this that he had just developed. And as he was telling it, we're getting to the meeting hall, and I thought, this is really interesting, but I hope he wraps it up. I've got to think about what I'm going to do in the meeting. At that moment, he says to me, and if someone had studied the system, they'd know you're getting a little angry with me right now. This is why Paul is so dangerous. Paul was interested in emotional contagion. He wanted to know what would the effect be of someone like Matthew, who was very, very upbeat, on someone who was quite the opposite. So Paul did a quiet phone survey of the faculty at the university where he teaches, asking who is the most abrasive, difficult, confrontational member of our faculty. Oddly enough, everyone agreed who that was. So he calls Professor X. He says, in the interest of science, would you take part in a scientific experiment? And the professor's delighted. He said, sure, I'd be happy to. As the day drew nearer and nearer, he started making demands which became increasingly outrageous. And so they had to dump him and go with the second most difficult professor. And the experiment was they're having Matthew and the professor have their physiology measured, and they're going to have a debate. The debate is on the premise that the professor should do what Matthew did. The professor had a very influential, secure, well-paid, tenured position, but the premise of the debate was that he would give it up and become a monk and go to a hermitage for the rest of his life. At the beginning of this debate, the physiology showed he was really agitated at the thought of that. Matthew was totally calm. So as the discussion starts, Matthew stays absolutely calm, and the professor gets calmer and calmer and calmer. By the end of 15 minutes, he's having such a good time, he doesn't want to stop the discussion. So our emotions are contagious, for better or for worse, particularly when we pay full attention to each other. I once was waiting for a bus on a very hot, humid day in New York City in August. It's a kind of day, I don't know about London, but in New York we have a rather invisible balloon around us. We're feeling a little prickly. It says, don't talk to me, don't touch me. And I had my balloon intact, and the bus pulls up, get on with my balloon, and the bus driver did something quite surprising. He actually spoke to me. He said, how's your day been? I was shocked, but I sat down, taking most of my bubble with me. And then I realized this bus driver is carrying on a conversation with everyone on the bus. You're looking for suits, are you? You know, there's a great sale over here on the right in this department store. And did you hear about the Monet exhibit on the left at the museum? Wonderful. And the Cineplex we're coming to here. I know the movie in Cinema 4 got the best reviews, but the one in Cinema 2, I saw it the other night, fantastic. You should. On and on like that. And then people would get off the bus, and he'd say to them, I hope the rest of your day is really wonderful. That man was an urban saint. He transformed everyone on the bus. He was sending ripples of good feeling through a city that sorely needed it. And I think the bottom line is, you know, you don't have to go to the Himalayas for decades. We all can do that in our lives if we pay attention. Thank you very much.
You mentioned the low cultures in America where there are murders every day. Steven Pinker writes very well about some of these cultures and explains that people will be killed over a simple slight, a disrespect or something. And it's ingrained in the culture, it's innate. The thing that I can see, there seems to be an insidious political correctness in the world today where we're not allowed to say that a culture is a rubbish culture. And in doing that, we don't address the problems with these people, so every day they continue to have the low expectations, the murders, the social milieu that creates and continues to create what you in America call the broken window syndrome. And I wondered what your view was on the inability for people to address these problems honestly and openly. And even going on to the fact that a lot of our condition is genetically inherited. The brain is no different to any other organ in the body. That whole groups of people get a particular kind of genetic.
Sure. Well, I think it's a very important question.
Yeah, it's not being addressed at all, and we're losing out over that.
Yes, well, I know of some data which speaks directly to that. I think, first of all, we have to be very careful about stereotypes. Because in any given neighborhood, there's a range of variation who happens to live there. There may happen to be some very talented young people who live in a neighborhood which is otherwise rife with problems. So for one thing, we should allow for individual differences. But generally, it's a worldwide problem what to do with children who grow up in dire poverty. Because for one thing, the brain is very fragile. So if you're not well nourished in childhood, the brain doesn't grow as well. And worldwide, children who grow up in poverty can have undernourished brains, which makes them susceptible to all kinds of behavioral problems, particularly when it comes to prefrontal development. As I mentioned, the prefrontal area is the one that manages emotions. So if you can't handle your rage, for instance, many people who end up in murderer's row, who've killed someone, have damage to the prefrontal area, it's been found. So we need to face this, as you suggest, starkly and see what the problems are and what the possible interventions might be. Because I would never write off an entire group of children. I would say instead, these are developing brains. Let's help them develop as well as they could. And in fact, I mentioned that the New Zealand study suggested that we have active interventions, particularly in early childhood. There's a famous study done it's called the Perry, P-E-R-R-Y, preschool study, where children children from a neighborhood like this had a very enriched program, and they did much, much better in life than other kids from the same neighborhood. And the question of IQ and class is very important to understand. In cultures worldwide where there's a privileged caste or class and an underprivileged caste or class, there was always a wide gap in IQ scores between the privileged and the underprivileged, and it's taken to be genetic. However, there's something called the Flynn effect. Flynn is a researcher at the University of Otago in New Zealand, and he's shown with vast data sets that every 3, 4, 5 years, when IQ tests are revised, they have to make questions harder. They have to make questions harder because kids become smarter every generation than previous generations. In other words, it's not fixed. The other thing he's found is that when a group from a caste or class which is underprivileged migrates to a country where the bias about that caste or class doesn't exist, their children do as well as other children. So it's not genetic. It's largely situational. So you're absolutely right. We have to look squarely at those situations and see what we can do to help. I have good news and bad news. The brain becomes anatomically mature in the mid-20s, but doesn't mean it's too late to change habit. However, habits instantiated in the brain in childhood are very strong. So if you end up, say, addicted or overly anxious or whatever it may be, it's still possible to change, but you need to make an added effort. And the reason is that you have to practice the new, healthy, better behavior over and over because you've practiced the bad way 10,000 times. You know, you've done it over and over, and the circuitry is so strong. But here, cross your arms. This is what a habit feels like. Now cross them the other way with the other arm on top. That's what it feels like to change a habit. It's a little weird at first, that's strange. But if you make the effort and keep making the effort at every naturally occurring opportunity, what happens is the neural connectivity for the new pathway gets stronger and stronger until at some point you pass a developmental landmark, a neural landmark, where you do the new habit, you perform the new habit, effortlessly without thinking about it. It becomes automatic. And what that means is that the connectivity for the new habit has now become stronger than the old one. It's the brain's default choice. But it takes work, it takes more work.